Today we'll be going over chapter 13 and learning how populations evolve. We're going to be watching a quick video about Charles Darwin and his discovery of natural selection and evolution, and then look at how all those mechanisms work.
The belief that God had created mankind in his own image and likeness was shared by most Western scientists until the middle of the 19th century. They thought all the creatures of the planet had been conceived by a divine force. That is, until Charles Darwin arrived. Some researchers were already talking about an evolution of the species, but the British naturalist was the first to explain with evidence how evolution might occur. By natural selection. His theory radically changed biology, offering a new explanation of the origin of human beings. It also made him one of the most influential scientists and intellectuals in history. But to get there, he had to make an extraordinary journey, perform hundreds of experiments, and spend 20 years refining his ideas. In 1831, Darwin was 22 years old and studying at the University of Cambridge when he was invited as a naturalist to a great expedition. He boarded the HMS Beagle and spent almost 5 years traveling several continents, starting in South America, from which he brought back dozens of live specimens, illustrations, and fossils. These fossils gave him one of the first clues about evolution. For example, observing the remains of a mylodon, a giant animal similar to the sloth, he thought that those similarities were probably not a coincidence. There had to be some kind of link. When he stopped at the Galapagos Islands, Darwin also observed its giant tortoises, which lived in nearby islands but showed unique physical characteristics in each island. In the humid areas, where vegetation was abundant, the turtles had a short neck and a dome-shaped shell. Whilst in the islands with a drier environment, they had a saddle-like shell and a longer neck. But could he explain that difference? Upon his return, Darwin spent time observing how animal breeders and gardeners crossbred animals of a species to create new varieties. For that creation to be successful, the artificial selection made by man was key. Darwin realized that the natural world probably made the same kind of selection, but he couldn't explain how it happened. Until he read the work of Thomas Robert Malthus, a British intellectual from the 18th century. In an essay on demography, Malthus said that as the population in Europe was growing, at one point it would increase much more than the food supplies available, and that would cause a fight for survival. This idea helped Darwin explain how evolution works. In nature, there is a struggle for survival, in which the strongest individual is not necessarily the survivor. Instead, it's the one which best adapts to the environment where it lives. If a living being has any trait that helps him to survive, it will be more successful at reproduction. Those which don't adapt will die without descendants. The creatures with the most success in reproducing pass their traits to their lineage, and so on, until these variations end up becoming a new species. That's why the differences between the Galapagos tortoises were a product of evolution. In a drier environment, those with longer necks could reach the bushes easily in order to get food, whilst those who lived in the humid environment could eat grass and protect themselves from predators, thanks to their shorter neck and the dome-shaped shell. Darwin said that all species, including humans, were not created independently, but they descended from a common ancestor. From then on, life on the planet began to diversify. 20 years after his trip, Darwin had written thousands of pages, but he hadn't published any. He wanted to have irrefutable evidence, perhaps because he knew that his theory was going to cause quite a stir. But everything changed when he received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, an admirer and fellow naturalist who told him that he had reached the same conclusion. Evolution was produced by natural selection. Darwin panicked, facing the possibility that Wallace could take sole credit for the theory, so the two naturalists agreed to present a joint letter explaining their findings. But a year later, Darwin published his book titled On the Origin of Species, and he became a celebrity way beyond the scientific community. His findings shook the foundations of Victorian Britain. Like Copernicus in his time, Darwin changed the game by explaining that diversity came from a biological process without any interference from God. Darwin put human beings in the same evolutionary level as all the creatures on the planet. Scientific advances have confirmed his theory.
All right, so that video gave us a good example of how Charles Darwin was able to make this great discovery of evolution and utilizing the things like natural selection. Now, before we talk more about that stuff, we're going to look at the 5 different evidences that prove that evolution is actually happening. So our 5 evidences of evolution. And our first one is our fossil record. So just like Darwin utilized the fossil record and saw that sloth, the older sloth fossil, looked kind of like the smaller sloth that he sees today. He was able to use that fossil record to determine that, yes, they must have evolved from that other type of sloth. And what we see is we look at the different layers of rock. The oldest layers of rock tend to have more simple living organisms, and the more earlier and earlier we get, we see more advanced type of organisms, and we can also see patterns from one layer to the next. So here is the Grand Canyon. You see the Colorado River has cut through the Grand Canyon, and every single layer would have different layers of fossils in them, and this being the newest layer and these being the oldest layer, you would assume to see the older type of fossils in that older layer and the newer type of fossils, or the more recent ones, in that new layer there. And this we can see through what we call transition fossils. So this is kind of a clade of modern day whales. And what we see is that the ancestors for modern day whales were actually terrestrial, so they lived on land and they had 4 legs. Well, as we look through their evolutionary fossil record, we can actually see they go from land living to semi-aquatic, then fully aquatic, and as they become more aquatic, they lose these hind legs because then they end up using their tail to move them through the water. And so our most recent ancestors to whales still have some of the limbs at the very end there. So here's another great transition fossil. So these are our Archaeopteryx, which is a transition fossil between dinosaurs and birds. So birds evolved from dinosaurs, and we have this great transition fossil of our Archaeopteryx that shows that. Next is this idea of biogeography. So biogeography is saying that because of different areas, so we had, before we used to have Pangea on Earth, but because of the moving of the tectonic plates, our continents eventually moved over to how we see the Earth today. And what happened is in Australia, we had these group of ancestral mammals called marsupials. So marsupials, instead of having their babies fully develop in the uterus, they develop partially in the uterus, then they go to their pouch, and then they fully develop inside the pouch of these marsupials. These are older forms of mammals. And what happened is when Pangea was all being spread out, majority of those marsupials got stuck on the Australia continent. And what happened is most of the other mammals continued to evolve, and went on to be our regular mammals that we call eutherians, which do full gestation of their young, so they come out of the uterus as a fully developed infant. Well, that didn't happen with these marsupials. They didn't continue to evolve that way. And so this biogeography shows that evolution was still occurring everywhere else in the world, but because of the natural selection that was happening on these animals, they didn't evolve into that next phase of mammals. So these marsupials are still around, and they're mainly found in the Australian continent. Next, we have our comparative anatomy. And so if we actually look at the anatomical structures of these different organisms, these different mammals, we can see that they must share an ancestor because of their different bone structures. So here, if you look at the humerus, very similar between our cats and our humans, probably more closely related than you see with our bats and our whales. And then as you go through all these different bones, you can see that they all have the same type of bones, but they've been adapted to whatever it is that they need. So a human uses all those metacarpals and phalanges as a hand and being able to use and grab things, where a cat's going to be using more to run and to scratch. A whale's going to be using it to be able to get through water, and so it needs a big fin. And then bats, since they fly, they've used it to create a wing. And so their bones that are in the wing are actually their hand bones. So we also see this in things called vestigial structures. So these vestigial structures are structures that were part of our ancestors, but they're no longer part of the current animals here, or they're still there, remnants of it. So with the whales, we talked about how they have their femur and their pelvis and all that kind of stuff, those old, those fossils of the most recent common ancestors of whales. With snakes used to be like lizards where they had legs. In fact, we have these skinks that still have legs, and if you ever see a skink move, they really don't use, they move more like a snake, but they still have these legs that they don't use. And even snakes have these, what they call spurs, these snake spurs at the very back of their body, and those are actually used to, they're vestigial structures from when they used to have back legs, right? And so they're no longer needed for the snakes, they're not using them legs, and so they're slowly going away. Us as humans, we also have this as well. We have our tailbone. Our tailbone is a bone representing that, yes, at one point we evolved from apes, and apes have tails and monkeys have tails and all that kind of stuff. And if you were even to Google image this, now it's not the most prettiest thing, so be careful if you decide to do this. So if you Google image human with tails, you'll actually see people who their coccyx here, which is their tailbone, is actually more developed, and you see they have this like little nub of a tail that's right at the very back of the bottom of their back, right above their butt. And this is just a vestigial structure from our previous ancestors. We don't need tails because we're not in trees. We're not needing to have that tail to keep us in balance and whatnot. And so that has slowly gone away over our evolutionary time frame. Number 4 is our comparative embryology. And this is kind of the idea that inside, as we develop as an embryo and then into a fetus and then into a full infant, that we are very similar looking at our younger ages of development. So even though we have our fish, our salamander, our tortoise, our chicken, our hog, our calf, our rabbit, and our human, we can see at the very early stages we all look very similar. But then as we go from the next stage, we see the older organisms. Here our fish, our tortoise, our salamander look similar, and then our tortoise and chicken look similar, and then the mammals look similar. And then as it becomes even more developed, you can see, oh yeah, these look similar, and all of our mammals still look very similar. So it's almost like we go through the whole evolutionary process as we're developing as a fetus into an infant. And then lastly is molecular biology. So recently we've been able to use our DNA to determine how closely related one species is to another. So with chimpanzees, their closest living relatives share 98% of their genome. So humans and chimpanzees are very closely related. 98% of our genome is the same. When we look at gorillas, they share 97% with chimpanzees. Orangutans, 96%. Gibbons, 95%. And then our old world monkeys share roughly 92.5% of their genome with chimpanzees. So we can actually look at the genetic makeup of an organism to determine how evolutionary closely they are related to each other. All right, so that's the end of this part. Next, we're going to start looking at specifically natural selection, evolution, and how they actually work to create these different variations in populations. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of natural selection that Darwin came up with. And so a good definition for that is individuals with inherited traits best suited for an environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than less fit individuals. So the whole idea here is that if we have a certain trait that the environment is benefiting us, then we're going to be able to have a better chance of staying alive, and not only staying alive, but reproduce and having offspring that will also be able to stay alive and reproduce. Right? So a good idea of this is kind of like with how the dinosaurs went extinct. So when you had that meteor that hit into the Yucatan Peninsula and it put all this dust and cloud, dust cover, and stopped the sun from penetrating down, what happened is then you had these big plants that couldn't now do photosynthesis and provide a lot of food for these large herbivore dinosaurs. And so these large herbivore dinosaurs started to die off because they no longer could survive. And then these large carnivorous dinosaurs that ate the large herbivore dinosaurs, they started to die off because they couldn't survive because their food was dying. And so what ended up living during that time frame were really small animals. And specifically, there was these small kind of shrew, mouse-like animals that then became the initial ancestors for all mammals today. And then when finally the smoke cleared and everything like that, after probably hundreds of years, and only these small animals that didn't need as much energy and much food now were out competing all these larger animals that needed a lot of food and a lot of energy and were dying off, they were able to live, and eventually they evolved as their environment evolved as well. And so that's this whole idea of natural selection. As nature changes, so will the organisms living in that area, depending on whether or not they're suited for those changes. And so with that, we can have a good definition also of evolution. So evolution is the accumulation of favored traits in a population over time. So in other words, as you have all these different favored traits, and they pile up, and over in a certain population over time, that's how evolution occurs. So it doesn't happen like instantaneously. We don't just all of a sudden evolve. It's something that takes time and time and time. And so when we look at the history of life on Earth and how it's evolved, we talk about it in hundreds, thousands, millions of years of evolution, because it takes time. You don't just have some small mutation that occurs and then all of a sudden now everything is like that. No, you have to have the environment actually act upon that mutation, and then if it does, then that individual is going to be better fit for the environment, have more offspring, and pass on that mutation, and then those people will be better fit and they pass on, and eventually it's a population that has evolved and the others have gone by the wayside. All right, so there are three truths of natural selection that we have to understand. So the first one is individuals do not evolve. So just kind of what I was talking about. One individual doesn't evolve, it's a population over time. Natural selection can only amplify or diminish heritable traits, right? So if you dye your hair and all of a sudden it makes it so that people are attracted to you, and then you have kids, well, those kids won't have that dyed hair, right? So really, it has to be a heritable trait, right? So you have to have something that you pass on to your next generation. And it's going to either amplify or diminish that, right? So amplify, so if you have a good trait, it's going to make you better to live and to reproduce. If you have a diminished trait, it's going to be harder to live and to reproduce. And so natural selection can only amplify or diminish those heritable traits, because once again, it's not about that individual. You have to be able to pass that trait on to the next generation. And then lastly, it's not goal directed. So what that means is it does not create the perfect organism. So you might think, oh, but us as humans were so evolved or so advanced, evolution must have been going down this direction. But it's not. Really, evolution has been favored to us in our brain size and being able to think and do things at a more advanced scale than other organisms. But we don't have the best eyesight. We can't run the fastest. We don't have the best smell. We don't have the best taste, all that kind of stuff. So evolution isn't trying to make the most perfect organism. It just works on the traits that are advantageous for that individual or that population at the time. It doesn't try to make things better or worse. It just is what it is. However, the environment is putting pressure on traits will determine what happens. And so now we go to what we call our biological fitness. This kind of talks about everything that we've just talked about. So biological fitness of an individual is the contribution an individual makes to the next generation's gene pool. So the gene pool are all the genes or all those alleles that are available in a population. So if you think of the population of humans, let's take eye color. So the gene pool for the eye color would be blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, hazel eyes, all of those genes represent the gene pools, or all those alleles represent the gene pool specifically for eye color. Now, if we think of all the different genes that we have that make humans humans, then, and all the different alleles, all the different traits in that is our gene pool. And so, really determining your biological fitness is how much you contribute to that next generation's gene pool. So for me, I have 4 kids. So I've contributed to the gene pool with 4 different children. Most of you, I assume none of you have kids. And so technically right now, I am more fit than you are biologically just because I've actually contributed genes to the next generation's gene pool where you haven't. But that doesn't mean that you're always going to be less fit. One of you might end up having more kids than me, or in that sense, right? So we don't determine it by who's the most fit now, but we look at that next generation and look at that next generation and see who was most fit based off of their next generation, right? Because let's say I have all my kids and none of my kids have kids. Well, guess what? My fitness was somewhat good, but technically my fitness becomes 0 because my genome, my contribution to the gene pool ended after my kids, right? So I was only fit for that next generation, but after that, my gene pool has been completely taken off the map in a sense because none of my kids had kids. So you can't really look at it always individually, even though we talk about it being individual fitness, but we have to take a step back and see kind of the whole generation from generation marked on it. All right, so less fit. So if they're fittest, they produce the most viable offspring, and if you're less fit, you produce little to no viable offspring. So we look at this with individuals within a population and find out who are the fittest, who are the less fit, and by that we can determine how that population is beginning to evolve, and more importantly, is how is natural selection working on that population, looking at those individual fitnesses. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to see some examples on how this works with natural selection and being fit. See here is that we have 3 outcomes for natural selection. And those 3 outcomes are directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. And we're going to use an example of these mice. So we have a population of mice. And in that population, you have white mice, gray mice, and black mice. And this is a bell curve, so in a graph to kind of show you, which different populations we have, and then how many number of them in that population. So the higher here it is, that's the majority of that are in that population. So in this population of mice, the most common phenotype, remember phenotype is the physical appearance of a gene. The most common phenotype is our gray mouse. All right, so this is just here. And we're gonna see what happens when we have different types of these 3 selections happen to this based off of how we're going to move the graph. All right, so we're gonna have a scenario where we have these mice that live in this population. Majority are gray, but we do have some white mice and we do have some black mice. And what we're gonna say is that a new predator has entered into the environment of this mice. And that new predator is an owl. And owls have really great eyesight. And what what happens is that these owls, since they hunt mostly at night, can see really well when the mouse is white, can see it very well. But a black mouse at night, even though the owl has really good eyesight, is harder for the owl to see than the white mouse at night. And so we introduced this new predator, this owl, into this population of mice. And after a few generations, what we see happens is because the white mouse have a harder time living, because the predator that was just introduced into the environment is kind of easily focusing in on them, and those that are kind of light gray and whatnot, they're going to be easier to see than our black mice. And what we're going to see is a directional shift in our population, and it's going to go to one of the extremes. So our two extremes were white mice and black mice. Before, there's very little of them in the population, but now because these black mice have it easier to live, because the main predator is having a hard time killing them, then this becomes the more prominent phenotype. And so what we see is a directional shift in our curve. So our original curve, the gray mouse was the largest phenotype. Now what we see is if you're gray or dark gray or black, that's the larger phenotype now in this population. And our phenotype of white mice is becoming less and less and less in this scenario. All right, so that's our directional, showing our blue for our blue here. Now we're going to look at a disruptive selection. All right, so disruptive selection is the creation of two or more equal phenotypes. So let's go back to our regular curve here, where our gray mouse is the one that is the high population, based off of our original curve. And now we're going to have a scenario where now the gray mouse is not going to be, so go back out, there's no more owl, we're going back to our original thing. So now we're going to have a scenario where this gray mouse is the one that's going to be selected against. So let's say there's a situation where in the environment, female mice prefer mice with either white fur or dark fur, but they don't prefer mice with gray fur. So let's say a new set of females enter the population of these mice, and they prefer the white fur or the black fur. And what we're going to have then is a disruptive scenario. In that disruptive one, what it does is it creates two phenotypes that are now the new, kind of the new normal. And our original phenotype is being selected against. And so there's becoming less and less gray mice because the female mice don't want to mate with the gray mice. They only want to mate with either a white mouse or a black mouse. And therefore, the population after generation and generation of black mice and white mice both increase, and the gray population decrease. So that's our disruptive. All right, let's take that back out, and now let's look at a scenario where we have our stabilizing selection. This one favors our original phenotype even more. So let's go ahead, let's bring back our owl. So let's say our owl is in this environment, but then there's another predator we're going to bring in the environment, and that's going to be a snake. So most snakes, they use the heat signature of an animal to determine where it's at, right? And so, as you probably know, a black mouse is going to absorb more heat, so its heat signature is going to be stronger than a white mouse. All right, and so here you have the owl who at night can see the white mouse better, and during the day you have the snake that can see the black mouse better because of the heat signature of it. And so what happens is the original population, which is our gray mouse, becomes even more populous. And the reason for that, once again, is because you have a predator here in the owl that can see the white snake. I mean, not the white snake, the white mouse. And then you have a predator in the snake that can see really good the black snake. And so those phenotypes are being acted on and being selected against. And then the gray phenotype is now going to be even more prevalent in that population because of them not having to deal as much with those predators. So they're able to live longer, produce offspring that are gray, and then they live longer, and yada, yada, yada. So that is our stabilizing form of natural selection. So those are the three different ways we'll see natural selection moving, and it's all based off whether or not that phenotype is being selected for or selected against in that natural environment. Now what we're going to be talking about next is looking at specific things inside natural selection that are different types of natural selection that kind of follow these directional shifts, or not I should say directional shifts, but these shifts in the phenotype, but they're actual specific scenarios. Here we see our mechanisms of natural selection evolution. So a little bit more on how these things actually happen and work. And so one thing we want to look at is genetic drift. So genetic drift is a change in the gene pool due by chance. So something by random happens and it changes the gene pool of a population. So our first one is going to be our bottleneck effect. So this is when you have a major reduction of a population in a short time due to an environmental effect. And so we call this the bottleneck effect. So to draw this kind of out, let's say we had a bottle, and in that bottle we had a bunch of marbles. And these marbles represented the gene pool of a population. And so we see, if we look at this gene pool in this marble, the red marble represents the highest in gene in this gene population. Now, if we were to take this bottle and empty it out into a dish, but we just did it really quickly, and because of this thin bottleneck, only so many marbles are going to get out. So as I do that, boom, empty it out, and what ends up happening is we only have a small amount of marbles that can make it through that bottleneck in that time. And so we dramatically reduced how many marbles there are in this population. And as we look at it, we see, okay, so 2 black marbles made it out. Well, there was only 2 black marbles at the beginning. And so now this that used to be very not well represented in the population now is highly represented in the population. And the red one is barely, and then the blue one is barely, and the green one didn't even make it into that. And so what we've done is we've actually reduced the gene pool or the genetic variance within that population. And because of that, it changes how that population is. Now this happens with the cheetahs. So cheetahs is a very good example of this. During the last ice age, because of where they were at, the cheetah population dropped down dramatically. And then when you had the white settlers coming into different parts of Africa and they were killing the cheetahs, then their populations once again dropped dramatically by these environmental effects. So one by the ice age and the other one by humans. And because of that, the genetic diversity of cheetahs is really, really low. Most cheetahs are highly related to other individual cheetahs. And so that's a problem for the group, because a lot of the times, if you mate with individuals that are very similar to you, you have genetic disorders that show up, and we see that a lot in cheetahs. And so there's a lot of conservation efforts in South Africa, specifically where they're doing genetic makeups of different cheetahs and making sure cheetahs that are genetically different enough are mating together to kind of build up that gene pool in the cheetah gene pool. So that's one aspect. So that's the BIOL effect. Once again, a dramatic reduce in numbers of a population. Now that gene pool isn't as diverse as it was before. All right, founder effect. This is when you have a small new group that stems from a larger group but has a differing gene pool ratio. So an idea of this is where you have a large population, and maybe of that large population, only 20 people decide to go and create their own new population, right? Well, the genes that they have as they leave the larger population probably don't match the ratio of genes that were in that larger population. And because of that, you usually see things that come about where a trait that was maybe hidden in a large population is now prevalent in this smaller population. So a great example of this is actually just here locally in Colorado City. So on your way out to like Kanab and on the border there of Arizona and Utah, you have Colorado City. So this is a population that stemmed away from the larger population of Utah because they were looking to keep the religious rights of polygamy. And so they moved and distanced themselves from that larger population. Well, that smaller population, one of the founders of it had a very rare genetic disease called fumarase deficiency. So fumarase is an enzyme that breaks down an acid called formic acid. So formic acid is something that comes about from our regular natural metabolism that our body has, and it can be very dangerous. So we have this enzyme that breaks down that formic acid once we're doing that. Well, people who have fumarase deficiency can't break down that acid, and what it does is it messes a little bit with their brain cells. And so what happened is one of the individuals that was part of this smaller group that left the larger group was heterozygous for fumarase deficiency, which means he had one good gene and one bad gene, right? Heterozygous. And because he had one bad gene, because he had one good gene, he didn't show any phenotypic effects of that because the one good gene allowed him to create enzyme fumarase and break down formic acid. But what ended up happening is because this one guy had multiple wives because of polygamy, he was able to pass on that fumarase deficiency gene to multiple children. Well, all of his wives all were normal for fumarase, so that wasn't a problem. So all of his children were half of his children were like him, where they were heterozygous for fumarase deficiency, and the others were just homozygous for fumarase, so they were fine. Now, this wouldn't usually be a problem, but in this inside this small community, because they didn't have a lot of other people to get married to, when you start having multiple generations, and then you ended up having people marrying together that were like second cousins, it then allowed it to where descendants of this one original founder. Maybe now they're twice removed as second cousins, but they're both ferm race heterozygous for ferm race deficiency. Now they could have a chance where 1/4 of their children would have ferm race. And what ferm race does, because it has that neurologic effect on it, it almost kind of looks like someone who has Down syndrome. And they've known about this disease since the early 1900s, but from 1911, I think, all the way till 1980, there had only been a handful of cases across the whole US. Since 1980, there have been a bunch of cases, and like 90% of those cases have all come out of Colorado City. And so they've now nicknamed that disease polygamous Down syndrome, because it kind of looks like someone who has Down syndrome that has this ferm rate deficiency. And it's all because when they were in this larger population, that really rare gene that he had was kind of lost in all the other genes. But because the smaller population, the small group, broke off from that larger group, now his very rare gene had more prevalence. And because of this idea of their practicing polygamy, he was able to pass that gene down at a faster rate. And so we've actually seen this come about quicker than what we would see in other small populations living in the human race, just because of being able to pass that down quicker through that polygamy. So that's founder effect. All right, our last one we're going to talk about is our sexual selection. So this is when you have an individual of a certain trait, and that allows them to obtain a mate better and therefore create offspring. And so there's two different ways that this happens. But before we do that, we need to talk. So really, let's go back to this. So the ability to be able to find a mate is crucial to be able to sending genes to the next generation, right? So if you are not having any kids, you're not sending any genes to the next generation, and you're not as fit, like we talked about previously. And so this idea of sexual selection is fairly important. So in a lot of species, you'll see sexual dimorphism, and that's when there's physical differences between the sexes. Now, if I were to bring in two dogs, let's say two Cocker Spaniels, and I were to hold both of them, and I'd say, one's a boy and one's a girl, tell me which one, you'd say, I'm not sure. Can you turn them upside down so I can see whether or not they have a penis or vagina, right? But no. But if you just looked at them regularly, you wouldn't be able to tell that difference unless you looked at their sex organs. Well, in some species, if I were to bring in two lions and I say which one's a male and which one's a female, you're gonna be like, oh, the male is the one that has the mane and the female doesn't. So you're actually able to determine what their species is based off their physical differences. That's sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism usually plays a part in sexual selection. So there's two different types of sexual dimorphism. First is female selection. In female selection, what we find out is the females have all the power in selecting a mate. And so usually in female selection, you see the males tend to be really beautiful. And we see this in like a peacock and a peahen. So a peahen is the female of the peafowl, and the peacock is the male. And the peacock has these beautiful feathers, these tail feathers that he shakes around, because he's trying to attract a female. And if you ever see a female, so a peahen, you'll see that they're like this brown looking turkey bird. Like they're not attractive at all. And that's because they get a pick on who their mate's gonna be. And so you see this a lot in birds. So birds will either have really colorful colors. They'll have like special dances that they do, all this kind of stuff, because they're trying to attract a female. We'll also see that like in betta fish. So if you ever have betta fish, the males are all beautiful and they have these beautiful fins and colors. And then the female, it looks kind of like a guppy. You wouldn't even think it was a betta fish. And that's because of female selection. That female chooses who she mates with based off of their appearance. All right, so a lot of different types of female selection. Now, male competition is usually on the male side. So male competition is usually when you see a male that is bigger, larger, and stronger, and those males then compete to be able to have the female, right? So you see this in like elk, and the elk have these big, huge, this big, huge rack of antlers, and they fight each other. And the bigger the rack is, the better chance they're able to fight off the other male, and then the female will then mate with him. So he's getting to have a say in it by being able to compete for that opportunity. And so you see this with like even elephant seals. So elephant seals, the males are huge. They're almost twice the size of the females, and they fight each other for a whole harem of female elephant seals, which means they're mating with multiple females, which allows them to pass on their genes to the next generation a whole lot. And that's all based off this male competition. So sexual selection plays a part in a lot of different organisms, not all of them, right? But in a lot of them, because of either female selection or that male competition. And that is the end of this chapter. The next chapter we'll continue to talk about evolution, but we're going to be looking at microevolution and macroevolution and the creation of species.